And I also see how just bits and pieces of our community, it's not there anymore. So at some point in time, we won't have that story. We won't have that history. We won't have that acknowledgement or any awareness of us being there and how we contributed to the fabric of Fayetteville. I know a lot of our structures are no longer there. Just in talking about the first Black elementary school in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the fact that was not an important enough structure to be historic or maintained, I have a problem with it.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we're diving into a story that's critical, not just for Fayetteville, but for all of Northwest Arkansas. A part of the story of Southeast Fayetteville, one of the city's most significant and often most overlooked historical Black communities here in Northwest Arkansas. For generations, Black families built homes and churches and businesses and a thriving sense of place in Fayetteville, despite the systemic barriers of segregation and racism. But over time, continued development and displacement have slowly been erasing much of that history through urban renewal projects that are built on Jim Crow-era zoning policies, the loss of Black-owned land, and a widespread failure to acknowledge the significance of the community that once thrived here. My guest today is Tommie Flowers Davis. Mrs. Davis has lived this story firsthand. Her family has been part of the fabric of Southeast Fayetteville for generations. In 1965, a full decade after Brown versus the Board of Education, she was one of the very first students to integrate in Fayetteville's elementary schools. She's been a social worker, an educator, a member of the Fayetteville Historic District Commission, and a local developer. And she has seen both the resilience of this community and the forces that have tried to erase it. Today, that work's underway to remember and reclaim that history. The city of Fayetteville is considering the establishment of a Black Historic District, an effort to formally recognize and protect the stories and the spaces and the legacies of Black families who have shaped this city. But that recognition won't happen unless a broader community understands why it matters and is willing to act. Because the truth is, you can't tell the story of Northwest Arkansas without the stories of the families who built, shaped, and sustained it. Many of those families came to Southeast Fayetteville after the Civil War, free people seeking land, stability, and a chance to build something new. They were often pushed to the margins, placed near industrial zones or floodplains, and kept close, sometimes physically and economically, to the families who once enslaved them. Still, they fought to establish themselves, founding schools and churches and businesses that became anchors of the community. This neighborhood was home to establishments listed in the Green Book that provided safe refuge for traveling Black families in the South. Today, Mrs. Davis shares about her work to define, reclaim, and create a community that reflects a deep heritage demanding our attention and respect. But that work has not been without great challenge. This episode and the episode to follow will work in combination to tell this story and explain how policy, planning, and land use have long been tools of exclusion and expulsion. But today we begin with Mrs. Davis and the neighborhood that raised her. A lot to get through today. Let's get into it. I have the privilege today of sharing a table with Tommie Flowers Davis, who is a longtime resident of Southeast Fayetteville, member of the Fayetteville Historic District Commission, and is a local developer as well, too, who's deeply invested in what it looks like to create equitable opportunities for housing and the development and places for people to belong in this community. And Ms. Davis, it's a privilege to be able to share a table with you. Welcome to this conversation.
Thank you.
I'm anxious to hear your story. I know there's an incredible amount of history within your life, and so I'm anxious to hear all of it. So please share all of that with us. But maybe we can start. I'd love to understand a little bit of your background and your story and maybe what roots you in this place.
Okay. I am a native of Fayetteville, born, raised, attended the Fayetteville School District. And my mother was originally from Fort Smith, and they moved here to Fayetteville when she was young, very young. My dad is originally from Mississippi, and the way he ended up in Fayetteville, he met someone from, I don't remember if it was Coca-Cola or Dr. Pepper company here, who was working in that area, I guess trying to get business or whatever. And he met my dad. He saw him several times, was real impressed with him, and told him if he ever wanted a job in Fayetteville, that he would give him a job in Fayetteville. So my dad eventually moved to Fayetteville, and this is where he stayed. This is where his roots and my mom's roots were. My mother, she attended the district when it was not integrated and was bused to Fort Smith, and they stayed in someone's house and were taken care of throughout the week, and then they were bused back to Fayetteville. And I think it was a pretty, not traumatic, but they never knew for sure about eating and just basic things, and just the fact that they had to leave their family for an entire week to go and get an education. That was her experience, and she graduated Lincoln High School. And basically, I think because of the educational experience, she did not advance as well as she could have when she was growing up. My dad, he quit school in the 8th grade because his mother passed, and he became a contributing member with his dad to take care of all of his siblings. So my dad had an 8th grade education. I have two brothers. One is deceased, one older, one younger. And my experience with Fayetteville High School was, or Fayetteville School District, the elementary schools were integrated the year that I was to start the 1st grade. And Lincoln High School, they no longer would have any classes there. And the way it was integrated, Center Street, which runs in our community, basically they drew a line down the middle of Center Street. Anyone south of Center Street went to Jefferson and Ramey. Anyone north of Center Street went to Washington and Woodland. So I don't know that it was intentionally done, but what it did was to create some kind of, I'm not going to say caste system, but, and I didn't learn this until later on, but the kids who went to Jefferson and Ramey thought that the kids who went to Washington and Woodland thought they were better than them. That in and of itself was not helpful as far as stabilizing the community and community relations, but that's just the way it went. I did not originally start out at Washington with the 1st grade. I actually went to Peabody, which was on the campus, and they were allowing faculty, staff, children to go to Peabody, and that was their attempt at integrating Peabody. And there were 6 children. There were 2 from each family who went to Peabody, and that was probably the best experience I ever had because they were very progressive, and they basically taught us so well. When I went to Washington in the 2nd grade, I was well above my grade level. But conversations were not favorable of them advancing me a grade, even though I was able to do that. And that was a loss for me because I think that would have helped me in the long run because I was bored when I was in the 2nd grade and maybe didn't learn as much as I could have. But I went through Washington, went to Woodland, and the situation with Woodland is that I think we had about 7 elementary schools there in Fayetteville at that time. 5 of them probably had no Black children. So you go from 7 elementary schools to 2 junior high schools. So you're going to have a number of white children who had not experienced going to school with Black children at that point in their educational life. And some didn't want to go to school with Black children. And we experienced those issues and had to work through them, not only with the students, even some of the teachers, but we were able to, and I don't know how this was arranged, but I remember Mr. Vandergrift, who was the superintendent at that time, would take a group of us to the administration, school district administration, and would talk to us about situations that we were encountering when we were going to school. And I don't know if his thing was they wanted to make sure that we felt safe and comfortable and okay about going to school at our respective schools. And so that really gave us an opportunity to say, hey, we're being picked on this way, or this teacher is acting this way or that way toward us. So it gave us an outlet for verbalizing those things, and not real sure what he did with them, but at least he was able to get our aspect of what was happening during that transition period. And of course, I went to Fayetteville High School. I left Fayetteville High School after the 11th grade. And although I did go back and finish my couple of classes that I needed for my diploma, I actually graduated with my class, even though I left a year before. But I was involved in the Upward Bound program, and they let me go to college after my 11th grade year. Mistake. How many people can go back to high school after you've been to college? So even though I did try and go back and go that year of high school, they would have considered me a full-time high school, full-time college student. And I was told that could not happen. And so even though I was registered and enrolled for 3 hours in the morning at high school, and then the afternoon I did my college courses, I had to withdraw from high school because I could not do both, according to their guidelines. The other impact was I didn't qualify for any kind of honors or anything that I had made up to that point because I didn't go my senior year, which I thought was ridiculous, but it didn't matter because I told my mother I would graduate. I did graduate. I did get my diploma, and that's what she wanted. There were issues at the high school, even not a whole lot, but there were issues where sometimes we were targeted. And in particular, I was a driver when I was in high school. So I would drive, I would park in the lot where all the other drivers would park. And there was a set of steps going into the building. Every morning, 4 girls would sit across the steps and would block me from going in the building. I reported it. Nothing was done. They continued to do it. And one particular day, I was just real frustrated. And there was one of the girls I saw by herself. And so we had words, and then we had a physical confrontation. This young lady went to the office and reported the confrontation, but actually said it was my friend instead of me, and I didn't understand that. And so when I found out that they were getting ready to send my friend home, then I went to the office to say, but it wasn't her, it was me. And I said, I have been telling you all that these girls were bullying me. They were trying to stop me from coming into the school every single morning. You all hadn't done anything about it. And now that something has happened to one of them, you're ready to send her home. But this other girl gets a pass when she's been bullying me every day. And the principal at that time was Mr. Bruner. And he said to me that, okay, he wouldn't send her home, but he was going to put her in school suspension. It was still not her that did it, and I didn't understand that. And so I guess he decided he would put me in school suspension too. But the other girl, the white girl, he was just going to let her go. And I admit, probably wasn't the right thing to do, but I called him a bigot. And he said, you're probably right, but you are too. And I said, you're probably right too. I said, we probably all are. And that's the way I handled that conversation with him. And so I knew that there was no support coming from him. And I just didn't even want to have anything else to do with him at that level, because when they could have intervened to help me, they didn't. But when it was time to have consequences, then they were ready to have some consequences that were negative. So I just really was ready to leave Fayetteville High then. I didn't want to go there anymore. But I stayed there through my 11th grade year and did well and transitioned to the U of A. And at the U of A, I was,
Ask you quick.
yes,
Tell us what year that was.
I left high school my junior year. 11th grade, I finished in 76. I graduated with the class of 77, even though I didn't have those two classes yet, but I graduated, and then I went back that summer and finished the two classes that I should have had, those two credits that I should have had, and that was 77. And so when I went to the U of A, I loved going to the U of A, but it was time to leave home. It was time to get away from Fayetteville. And so I did stay there until I was a second semester junior, and that was primarily because I wanted to get all my basic stuff done and already working on my special area, which originally was psychology.
Can we back up for a few minutes? I want to understand, because obviously you've described your experience, which does not sound like obviously a good experience through Fayetteville Public Schools at that time. But can you take us maybe back a little bit farther? And I would love to understand, like, your earliest memories of maybe growing up in Southeast Fayetteville. What did the neighborhood feel like? What was it like? What do you remember? What are your memories from that time in that place?
And I'm glad you asked that, because I don't want it to look like it was all a bad experience, because when we were younger, we had different community people who would take, for example, Miss Basher, and she would take a group of us to her house, and she would work with us on reading and English and all those other things. And then we had, strangely enough, we would go to a house that was on campus, and I think that's where the alumni building may be, right. We learned to play orchestra instruments. So we were involved in orchestra, and that was when we were young. That was probably before the first grade. So we were very young, getting exposed to a lot of different cultural things. And we knew that when they finally integrated us, the goal was assimilation. And they did everything possible to involve us, engage us in activities that would make us more like them, the majority. And for the most part, that was, I can't say easily done, but when you live it every day, that's what you learn. And what an invaluable experience. I didn't recognize it then, but when I left and really faced worldly things, I was prepared. And I would not trade that experience for anything, because we were essentially taught by whites. And we were taught how to function, live, work in that environment with that culture. So when I went out into the world, I was prepared. And I think to the extent that I was able to not only go to school with white children, had lots of good friends. And what was so unusual is that most of the kids who befriended the Black children were children of the more prominent white families, doctors, lawyers, business people. They were the ones who basically connected with us for whatever reason. I do not know. And even now, we have long-lasting friendships with a number of our peers who we went to school with over time. And the thing that I understand and know the most is that I would be a totally different person if I would not have had that experience, because I would not have been prepared for living in the world, basically. I think the sad thing about it is we were very connected as a community, and we did things as a community, and everybody was everyone's child. You didn't do anything wrong without getting consequences from that person and your parents once you got home. So you were raised in that community. And it was none of these, don't mess with my child, don't discipline my child. No, it's like you have the authority, you have the right. You discipline them, and then I'll take care of them when they get home. And we knew that. And that was a part of how we developed. But we also had those institutions that supported that level of community and connectedness, whether it was Lincoln School before they demolished it, because we were having lots of cultural events at Lincoln School. We'd have some form of school in the summer where they would work with us on all kinds of educational things. We would have parties. I did my very first piano recital at Lincoln School. So that was how we formed our community. That's how we stayed connected. And even Sherman's Tavern, I know it was just a little whatever it was, but that's how we stayed together as a community. You could go inside there, you could play pool, you could listen to music, dance, whatever you wanted to do. Or there was a whole culture of people just sitting out and around and talking and enjoying themselves. So that was gone. Lincoln School was gone. Where they have the Head Start now at Willow Heights, the Head Start, we did a lot of activities there as community people. Once those things were gone, and then you moved the church out of the community. And that was a big factor that also affected how we functioned as a community, to the point that we have generations of kids now that can't even relate to that part of Fayetteville being part of their culture. They don't understand it. They don't even understand community though either. So I think that's been the hardest part for me to see, is that I know how rich our culture was because of how we grew up and because we were a very strong-knit community. And the kids who, a couple of generations after us on, there's no relevance to them, and that's not good.
You said something that I think piques my interest. You said they don't understand community. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming your definition of community was formed and shaped in this place in Southeast Fayetteville.
Yes. Uh-huh.
I'd love for you to speak. What does that mean to understand community?
My community was, for example, I have young ladies right now, we call each other sisters because we grew up being very close-knit. And it was as if nobody's going to let them bother you. We just had that type of relationship. I have people who now they may call me mama because I developed those kind of relationships with them throughout time, though. But it's just how we did everything together. We may have not had any blood relation, but we all considered ourselves as relatives, even though, and it's who are you related to? And the question is, who am I not related to? Because we all felt that type of kinship, even though it may not have been a blood relationship. We would have all kinds of community activities. We would eat at each other's house. We would have slumber parties, anything that we did which kept us as being a part of each other's lives. That's what we did as community. And our parents, they'd make sure we had Sunday dinner. We would have those kind of things. And it may not have been just our family because everybody was a part of the family. People would drop in for our family dinners. We'd go to their family dinners. It was just a whole system of how we functioned with each other and around each other and that kind of thing. Church was a big one. We did a lot of church types of activities, and it was not okay to not go to church. It was not okay to not go to Sunday school. And so families have gotten away from that too, but that was a source of our strength as well.
I'm curious, you search those memories, like, what does this community in South Fayetteville mean to you today?
The community in South Fayetteville now has changed significantly. I don't see the connectedness. I don't see community, as a matter of fact. And it makes me sad because I know of all the advantages we had just being able to develop strong relationships, how we connected and the things that we did together. Those things are not happening now. There's not even this real strong affiliation or association with a church now. And that's where a lot of people have gotten their strength and their understanding of just people in general is being connected through the church. But there's no real church anymore to be connected with. I know that we have churches in the community, and St. James, which was the more prominent Black church, is now no longer, St. James Baptist is no longer in the community. The St. James United Methodist, which was my church, It's almost non-existent. It's lost most all the members, and it's a dying church. It really is. And it could have so much potential because it is positioned right there in the community where it could attract so many different residents of that community given the right ministry. But that's not what's happening. So that's a dying church. Church of Christ is a pretty good functioning church. And I think there's a lot of community, family, those types of relationships that's formed in that church. But as a whole, the community is totally different. The gentrification that's gone on because of how families have lost their legacy. They've lost their property. They don't own anything anymore. We have the big eyesore that's sitting on the hill, Willow Heights, that has had no resources or anything put into that whole. One of the nicest parts of Fayetteville has one of the worst housing presentations that we could ever have. And that I'm still struggling to understand that. And I have a whole lot of feelings about that whole situation.
Maybe this would be a good time to maybe I have one more question for you.
Okay.
And then I want to move to your kind of the work that you're doing today
Okay.
and your background to that too. When I asked you, what does this community mean to you today? Maybe, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe compare that to what it meant to you growing up.
Okay.
If I can. I'm going to ask you to return back to that space. What was, when you think about this community from your childhood and the beauty of it, what was the essence of that really returns to you in that space?
I think what I remember the most about that community is how close and how relevant each one of us was to the others. There was just a level of friendship and kinship and understanding and respect we had for each other and for institutions that were, I mentioned Sherman's, I mentioned the church. There was just such a level of, I guess, I used to, when I would go outside of Fayetteville, I would have to advocate for Fayetteville and what it was really like, because I had a lot of people who would say, "You're from Fayetteville? No Black people live in Fayetteville." And I would say, "Yes, we live in Fayetteville. We live east of the courthouse." There was a very distinct boundary that I can't say that now, because some of us live east of the courthouse, but it's not the same. I don't know how to say it. It's not really considered a Black community anymore, even though that's probably where we still have the majority of the Black community. But I was like an ambassador of Fayetteville. I would say, "Oh, yes, but Fayetteville this, Fayetteville," just to try and some of the myths that people had about Fayetteville and basically sharing with them how good I felt about growing up in Fayetteville, which was hard for people who were outside of Fayetteville to really understand. So I think just having very good and meaningful experience as a child and young adult I get a warm feeling when I talk about Fayetteville then. Fayetteville now is just, okay, it's a place for me to live, and I'm wanting to contribute to my community and put something in that community that people can be proud of. And that's one of the things that I really wanted to do. Just like my mom, she fought the battle. She wanted to build. She wanted to do something for her community and was blocked every way that you could think of by the city of Fayetteville so that she would not do that. And I want to do that. And that's what my real purpose, hopefully, is, to do something that's going to really make our community something to be proud of. And right now I see it as I'm here, live here, I exist in this community, but it's not really that, I don't know how to say it. I don't have the same feeling as it being my childhood community that I had then.
Let's come back to that.
Okay.
Because I would love to learn a little bit more about the work. You have a career in social work that you started in.
Yep.
And you're welcome to share anything about that you would like. And I also know that you're working as a part of a developer in Fayetteville, in this area, to help create housing opportunities for people and to do that in a way maybe that's not being done today. And so I would love for you to share your background and your story about how you maybe either got into social work, how you transitioned into becoming a housing developer, maybe just a little bit of the background there. So then we'll come back to what you're talking about, because I want to make sure that we've got some context around that.
Okay. I started out in psychology at the U of A, and what was unfortunate is my advisor, who I really liked, committed suicide. And I think that was probably not that, I don't know if I want to be in psychology, but it was probably more just a subconscious thought of, okay, I have this advisor, he's in psychology. Do I really want to be in psychology? But I did a pivot at that point into social work. Not that I knew anything different between social work and psychology. I don't think I had a clear understanding of the difference or anything like that. But sometimes I just say things it was God, because I don't know what led me into social work. I've always been a helper. I could always talk to people. I have always been someone that other people can talk to. I have always been someone who was non-judgmental, and I guess those were some of the things that got me into this social work environment. So when I went to A-State, I was a second semester junior, and when I transferred to A-State, I thought, okay, Jonesboro, pretty much same makeup as Fayetteville. I'll do okay in Jonesboro, but that was probably one of the worst mistakes. Totally different culture between Jonesboro and Fayetteville. It was very backwards and not very open to blacks there. And so I didn't want to stay. I stayed there to complete my degree, but the day after I left and I went to Little Rock. I did not want to hang around in Jonesboro. So I went to Little Rock, I started the master's program, and once I completed the master's in social work, I just decided to stay in Little Rock. I liked the environment, I liked the culture. I was also married at that time, so that's where I stayed. And I actually started out I was a paralegal / social worker in a law office, and Reagan happened. And those positions were eliminated. A lot of those were eliminated because I worked for legal services. So at that point, I went to work at Children's Hospital. And what was my experience at Children's started out really, the director at Children's Hospital told me that she hadn't hired anyone like me before, and she didn't know if I would be able to work up to her standards. So what she was going to do was give me a position, but as a temporary worker. I'm thinking to myself, she doesn't know me. I grew up in Fayetteville. I was taught by the best, and she only offered me a challenge at that point in time. So, of course, she hired me, and I stayed there. But as I was working for her, I also realized there was no chance of me advancing under her. As long as she was director, I would never go any further. So I eventually went to Timber Ridge Ranch, which is a brain injury rehab facility, and I started out as a therapist. And after a year, I advanced to a program case manager. Basically, I had one of the rehab teams that I managed for a group of clients, and I've always worked with adult clients that had traumatic brain injuries. And then I worked for them I was into my 29th year when I had my accident on the way to work, had a brain injury, had other injuries, and was not allowed to go back to work. That was a hard pill for me to swallow. But not only was I working there, but I also was involved with a drug and alcohol program. Our church had a prevention intervention. I don't know, sometimes my words just get lost. Prevention intervention program through our church. That was one of our ministries under United Methodist Church. And so I was on the board, and then I just decided, we've got something good going on here. This needs to go to a different level. And up until that point, it was mom and pops. They basically were getting a little grant funding here, a little there. But I saw the potential in this program. So I did all the policies and procedures, protocols, handbooks for the staff, and then trained everyone. And I submitted our application to the state of Arkansas, and we became the first faith-based program that was certified under the state of Arkansas. And they used us quite a bit as a model when talking about the type of holistic. We were treating every aspect of that person through our program. So that was like my baby that I birthed, and I just didn't want to give it up. So I stayed involved with that program until I had my accident as well. And then just a little bit of involvement even after that. Anything from being the director of the treatment program to being I did the training of staff, in-servicing, all those things throughout my involvement there. So I also did that, as well as I worked in private practice, and I did the families that were involved in the court system because of abuse and neglect. So I would do individual family therapy with them, as well as also another part of that was going into homes, doing home assessments, home evaluations to either open the home for foster care or adoptions, or to continue those homes in the foster care system. So I had a whole umbrella of things that I did in the name of social work. And when I had the accident, those things came crashing down. And that was a big eye opener. That was a big experience for me. And that was in 2016. My brother had heart issues and he had to go to Dallas. I went with him to Dallas, and they ended up keeping him because he was, they didn't feel like they could send him back. He was too sick. So we stayed in Dallas from like January to the end of March, getting his care. He continued to deteriorate and came back to this area, ended back up here in Fayetteville, and he passed in April. My mother was already sick, and I started having to be her companion. I couldn't really take care of her, not any physical needs, but other things. And she passed in July of 2017. So I had two family members who passed back to back who had property. So I had no interest in building construction, none of that. I just didn't. My mother was a self-taught carpenter. I had no desire to return to Fayetteville. I'm in Little Rock. Why would I want to go back to Fayetteville? And then things started happening with their properties, and people were staying in the properties. It didn't matter how we secured them. They were just, because I didn't get the utilities turned off. To me, that's more one of those other final things. And I guess maybe I wasn't quite thinking that. So at some point in time, I just couldn't figure out what I was going to do with myself. I had both my boys were graduating. I think they graduated in 2018. Yeah, 2018. They didn't need me as much. So I basically going through my little depression, trying to figure out what's next. I got I say a message from the Lord. I have to say that, basically telling me that I really need to look around and I need to look at this. I didn't understand it at first. I was getting so many calls about the properties. Do you want to sell? What are you going to do with your property? And I'm thinking, I'm not going to do anything with that property. Eventually, when I got that message, you need to look around, you need to figure this out, then I ended up having to demo my mother's house. It was like 4,200 square feet, and she had just built and added on. And I realized later on that was her ministry. She would go to Salvation Army at Seven Hills and get those guys to do day labor. She would pay them. She would feed them. They'd be company for her. They'd help her lift. That was her ministry. And I just couldn't keep the house because when the tree fell on it and the roofer did not repair it, it continued to rain in the house. So I had to demolish her house. And that's another property that I will hopefully develop before I finish what I have going on. And so then when I decided, okay, I can probably build something or have something built, and I started talking to contractors and developers, I had no clue what they were talking about. It was way, way above my head. And so I went to NWAC and I talked to a guy at NWAC and I said, I see you got these 2 certificate programs and I'm thinking about getting a house built. Maybe if I do the certificate programs, that'll help me understand the industry. And he said, you need to be in our construction program, our construction technology program. And from that conversation, I went to enrolling in construction technology. And it was a challenge because here I am, 60 plus, brain injured and old, and haven't been in school since whenever. And it was very challenging. But I graduated magna cum laude after all of that. And it amazing. It was very,
I believe that
very shocking. And as I was going through that program, I was needing to intern under someone. And I had been talking with a contractor already, and I was gonna intern under him, and basically he was gonna give me an hour a week. He started getting busier, and then the time was not good. So I asked Z. Niederman. Now, mind you, I had already asked Z twice, and he told me no. But I asked him this time, and then we were into COVID at that point. And I said, I still have to do an internship. And he was telling me all the reasons why he didn't think it would be a good thing for me to do. And he's small, and he can't get his group together, COVID, this, COVID. I said, Z, I'm going to have to do all that. I may as well learn how to do that too. So I started an internship under him, the best experience I could have ever had, best experience. He was so transparent. I knew where everything was going dollar-wise. I knew when we messed up. I knew everything. He kept me involved in every aspect of learning how to build. And that was probably the saving grace for me, because he also pushed me and said, you got to get your contractor's license. You got to do it. He said, because I want you to do your next project. And the difference between him and the first contractor I was working with, the first contractor said, when you build, when you realize you won't make anything out of your first project, this is just going to be for like a learning experience. I'm thinking, okay, but I got the property. Why wouldn't I make anything? That was his thing. And then when I took the information to the banker that he set me up with, the banker said, you must be using top of the line everything. And I said, no. I said, to the contractor that we're not going to do top of the line. We've got to do good products, but not top of the line. He said, have you got this bid out by anyone else? And I said, no. He said, I want you to take this and let someone else bid on it. Then come back and we'll see what's going to happen. And so basically, I had some other just gut thinking vibes. And I said, well, this is probably not the person for me to work with. So I had already attempted to get loans, Arvest twice. Now, when I talked with Genesis, which is the bank I was working with, the other contractor, he didn't say no, he wouldn't work with me. He was just telling me what I was going to have to do for them to be able to work with me. And then the situation happened. So I went with the bank that Z was already working with. And he introduced me to the senior banker in the commercial loans, did a pitch for me, vouched for me, everything. And this senior banker said, I'm going to connect you with someone else because I'm already doing 2 of Z's projects and I don't want to get you all's money mixed up when you're doing drawdowns. So he connected me with another banker, and he said, we know Z, we know his product, we know how his houses turn over quickly, and he's vouching for Ms. Davis. I want you to work with her and make this happen with her. Now, every time up until then, I was told that I would need to have $20,000 to $30,000 in an account that was expendable, and I did not have that. I had not been working at that point for a number of years, and for the first probably year, I didn't really have any income. And so I knew I didn't have that, but I said, I have my 401k, we can't use that. I have all this property, we can't use that. Why can't you? Okay, so I didn't understand that. They couldn't use my property, couldn't use the 401k. It had to be the expendable cash. So I've been told by Arvest twice, Even the other two banks said I needed expendable cash. I went to Arvest. Z introduced me. I ended up getting that loan to build my 3 houses without having taking a penny to the table. And that wasn't nothing but God. I know, because if it wasn't something that was right, then it wouldn't have worked out. And so that really inspired me to know that He's got my interest. God's got my interest. He's sending me to all these good people. Z is good. Z introduced me to Allie, who is with Flintlock. And Allie has basically driven this process for this next project that I'm working on. And there have been so many issues with the city in this particular project that both Allie and Z said this has been the most difficult project that they have worked on. And they both have built all over Fayetteville, Northwest Arkansas. This one has been the most difficult build that they've ever dealt with. And we're still jumping through hoops.
Is that Allie Quinlan?
You know her?
I do.
Yeah. She has been, I don't know, like I said, I believe in a higher power. That's all I can say. And I have to give him the honor, because I would not have gotten this far without her, without Z pushing me to get my contractor's license, and he basically said, I want to make sure, when I was talking about the internship, he said, I want to make sure you have a good experience, that you learn a lot, and that you make some money. And I'm thinking, make money? So you think I'll make money? And the other one said I won't make anything. So those were things that were very encouraging to me in just this whole process. And then Allie, who picks up the ball and runs with it. And when I'm encountering these issues with the city and I have to get her involved, then there's a totally different perspective. And it's, why are you all taking me through this if we're coming back to the same point anyway? So if it comes from Allie, it's great. But if it comes from you, we're not going to work with you like that. And it's been such a struggle. I have had to get them to give me back pieces and parts of my mother's property that they took. And they're having an issue saying that they took it. But basically, when you tell a person that we're going to run this sewer main across your property, and they make sure they run it across the center of the property, and they tell her if she doesn't go along with it, no, they're saying, we're going to start this condemnation process. Here's $1,000. You can take it, you can leave it. But we're going to start the process. Or you can take us to court. Either one. She didn't have any money. It was like a bullying thing. You've got to give us this property. And she was telling me all along that they were taking her property. Then she told me they took her property. My mother went to her grave with me saying they didn't take your property, because I didn't understand what had happened until I actually did my own research into it, getting ready to build. And that's when they told me the property is considered undevelopable. So they did that, and then they deemed it undevelopable so that she could not build. That was in 90, but in 79, they approved her for a 7-plex. And after she finished with the Board of Adjustments or whatever they're called, they told her she had talked to the engineer. The engineer shut it down. They said, you're building in a flood zone. You can't build in a flood zone. Everybody knows you can build in a flood zone. But that was the first thing they used. The second thing they used was, you got to get rid of some of those permits you have already before we'll issue any more permits. She was rehabbing her house. Had nothing to do with that project. She was rehabbing her house. So she would go to the city on numerous occasions asking if she could get her permits, and they were telling her, no, we're not going to give you the permission. I even went with her twice when they told her that. I didn't know all the other pieces and parts of it as far as why they weren't giving her the permits. And I know one time my mother went to the city, and I have a cousin that worked for the city. And when she left, they were making fun of her. My cousin went to them and said, I don't know if you all know it, but that's my aunt, and you all better not ever do her like that anymore. And she called me crying. And she said, will you please tell your mom not to come to the city anymore like that? She said, they're just making fun of her. I said, I can't tell her anything. And I couldn't. I could not tell her anything. But that was one of those things where if she would have had me advocating, I probably could have gotten her a little bit further along, but I didn't have that kind of understanding and knowledge of things. And I certainly didn't think they took her property, and they actually did because they told her it was undevelopable. And so when it was presented by Flintlock as taking a property without compensation, Kit Williams said, we paid her for the property, and I know where to get the information. So I had done a FOIA request, and when I did the FOIA request, I asked them for anything, any documentation related to that property and that line. And they sent me about 3 or 4 pieces of paper, and I called and I said, is this it? And they said, that's all that we have. I said, so was the property owner compensated? And they said, no, the property owner was not compensated. Allie even followed up to make sure that she was not compensated. They said, no, she was not compensated. So that information was not provided to me in the FOIA request. And then I realized they really hadn't given me anything from water and sewer. So I called Corey at Water and Sewer, and I said, I did the FOIA request, but I didn't get anything from you all. And so he did the research, and he called me back. He said, I have some stuff, Ms. Davis, and I'm going to send it to you. He said, now, some of it is handwritten, and it may be hard for you to read. He said, but I'm going to send you all this that I have. And that's when we started discovering, because we were trying to figure out why they changed where the line was running. They changed where it was running because Niblock didn't want it to run through his property, which was across the street. So they didn't want to hurt his ability to do what he wanted to with his property, but they didn't care about how they did my mother's property, and then deemed it and continued to harass her about donating it for park space and green space. That was their whole agenda. They wanted it for park space and green space, and she would not do it.
And this is in the 70s?
She got it approved to build in the 79, but they did the sewer line in 1990. So from 79, and I can imagine how she was going up there on a regular basis trying to get her permits to build her building that they had approved. But 1990 is when they actually ran that sewer main across her property. And it's so obvious the way they did it. It's obvious they meant to do it that way. And especially because they had adjoining properties on both sides of her property. But that's the way they chose to run it.
Are you okay on time?
I don't even know what time it is.
It's 2:15.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm happy to let you, I want to ask you some questions.
Okay.
Because I think, I'm happy for you to keep talking about this too, if you want. I want to understand, number one, I'm sorry, that I'm trying to get my head around that 1990. I really am. Oh my gosh. Okay. We have to maybe mentally reset here a little bit.
I know that's a lot. I understand.
Well, no, it's because I think it's a systemic governmental institutional actions that maybe I'll ask you this, and this may not be a fair question and you can wave me off, I think, but like when I hear this story of maybe what's happened in Southeast Fayetteville around your family's property, it's hard not to draw back and think about systemic policies that have discriminated against people over years and years. Is that a fair comparison? Do you view it that way? Or how should we place that kind of, these kinds of situations within the broader scope of not only the history of our country or our region, but the history of this place as well too? And
I definitely think that it's systemic, and it started way before that because Fayetteville City wanted that whole area. And there were attempts or talks about condemning houses so that they could take over that whole area. And they talked jail expansion was, a convention center, different things, but they did not want the blacks living in the area. So when they originally proposed to the blacks that they would buy them out, the community organized, and they would have their meetings at the Methodist Church. And what was happening is that you had some blacks who were custodians and stuff, and they would work courthouse, different places where they would overhear conversations. Sometimes the conversations dealt with whose house they were going to target next. And so the community would organize, they would talk about whose house next, and they would all try and get together and bring that house up to a better standard of living. So they decided back during that time that they weren't going to sell. They weren't going to let the city take their houses, and they weren't going to sell. They wanted to relocate 71 right through that community. So it was property that the city had its mind set on getting long ago. And when the opportunity came for them to do some zoning things or running infrastructure kinds of things, how you run it across people's property where it takes away the value of it, they did those things. And it's very obvious. You can look, they did those, just like the sewer line that runs through my property, starts on Spring Street, goes to Huntsville, and they've run it across several pieces of property just like that, where it's taking someone's ability to use their property the way they want to use it. Because you've got this water line and a 20-foot easement down the middle of someone's property. And it was the plan, basically. It was their plan for us to not live in that area. And when it didn't happen in the manner that they thought, which was condemning and buying people's property, their mindset was, we'll just wait. Because these adults, these home property owners, they're going to die. And the next generation is not going to have that same level of commitment. That's exactly what happened. People started losing their property because the thing about when we grew up in the ghetto, we grew up in the undesirable part of Fayetteville. So our goal was to leave that area. And they knew that we were leaving, and we didn't really care about the property. We didn't really care. The houses were substandard. They built with what they had to build with. And a lot of times it was substandard material. Right now, they always say, you use the community development block, the CDBG, but one of the things with that is that the foundation has to be stable. Those houses were built on unstable foundations because they didn't use the correct materials. They used what they had. So there's an automatic exclusion to accessing those resources. That could work wonders if they would have a pot over here that would say 4 foundations, and that would give people an opportunity to access those resources to make their homes better. It's people who would literally live in their houses if they could get rehab, source of rehabbing those houses. It's not happening. It's not going to happen because as long as they exclude due to foundation issues, and these are people who really don't have that type of money to build. And then we have the stormwater drainage off of Mount Sequoia that has moved every one of our foundations that live on the hill, including mine. And it's an issue where they're not willing to put, and that doesn't only affect the blacks, it doesn't, but because our houses are probably built less sturdier or whatever, it has a harder effect on our houses. And that's a city issue.
Ms. Davis, one of the things that, as I sit across the table from you, this is a work of establishing a historic district in Southeast Fayetteville. This is your home. This is not an abstract thing that we're talking about in any way, shape, or form. Mm-hmm. So maybe from your perspective, why does this matter so much to be able to establish a historic district in this place?
Need for our culture, our history, our heritage to be acknowledged and recognized and talked about in a manner where people know Black people did live in Fayetteville. Black people did contribute to this culture. And that is not being told. Or maybe it's not being told in a way that sometimes it's not being told, sometimes it's just not correctly told. That is so important to me right now. And I also see just bits and pieces of our community, it's not there anymore. So at some point in time, we won't have that story. We won't have that history. We won't have that acknowledgement or any awareness of us being there and how we contributed to the fabric of Fayetteville. I want that to be, that's what I want to see. I know a lot of our structures are no longer there. If there's anything that's still there that can be salvaged, let's do that. Let's also make sure we acknowledge where other structures were and the historical perspective of those structures. Just in talking about the first Black elementary school in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the fact that was not an important enough structure to be historic or maintained, I have a problem with it. This was I guess it was the first elementary school, public elementary school, from what I understand. So why was it not important enough to maintain that as a historical structure? I just don't understand that. It's as if we are not important. And I know I'm important enough to, and I don't even consider my story when I hear people talking about your story, I have to really wrap my head around that even. This is just my life, and this is how I lived it. And I don't see it as anything really special, but I do think the stories that we have, the lives that we lived, the ways that we have contributed have to be told and salvaged. And I also think there needs to be a concerted effort on the city of Fayetteville to do something with the infrastructure in that area, to do something to make it look like a thriving community. There's no investment in the industry. I can tell you, since I've been here, not so much lately, but it seems every week there was the water going off because another break in the pipe. And they just patch the pipe up and keep going, then it'll break somewhere else. And why is it that they're not replacing the pipes? That's some of the oldest part of Fayetteville. But they just patch a pipe and keep going. I have to pay for running a water line from Willow Street to my property because the city did not keep that water line maintained and it galvanized. So as a developer with limited resources, I have to put in a water line because the city doesn't pay for it. And obviously they don't maintain them either. But those are things that when you look at that community and you look at what it can be, if there was any kind of attention paid to that community. Only time it got attention was when they were talking about tearing down the projects and doing this luxury community there. That wasn't for us, but they see the value in it. The fact that I can sit on my porch or look out my window and I see woods and I see deer and it's like you're living in the city, but you have such beauty in that, you have such beauty in it. And why is there nothing that the city can contribute to make that a healthier environment? It just hasn't been their goal.
What would you ask of our community?
I would like for the community to understand that this is just not Black people saying we need to have something, we got to have something. I think that if they could recognize the value in what us having something would bring to this community, because if done, we could bring a lot of value to not just the community, but the community as a whole, to Fayetteville. Because not only will we have a much better living environment, much better from a physical standpoint, I think there are just so many economic and cultural things that we could add that would attract more people. It's like, why do Black people not come to Fayetteville? Because they don't know Black people live in Fayettille. They don't know there's this rich history or this heritage that we have to share. And maybe if we can make that known to people here who can accept it and maybe even feel a little bit proud of it, maybe that will encourage other people to come. I don't even know if I answered your question.
You 100% are answering my question. What do you ask of the city of Fayetteville to make this happen?
I would love to see the city of Fayetteville deal with some of the infrastructure that we don't have. I think they need to do, unfortunately, they need to do the water and sewer lines that are horrible. They need to deal with the stormwater drainage that comes off of that mountain. Now, that's, like I said, that's not only going to help us, but that's something that needs to happen. This is a responsibility that the city should be taking care of anyway. I would just like for them to see and support the fact that we have a contribution to Fayetteville. And just us getting to this point has been a challenge because there are people in Fayetteville who don't support this. They don't understand why we need to have a Black historic district. Not only Blacks, not only whites, but there are Blacks who really don't understand what it means either. And just trying to get them to rally around it and understand it is something that we're struggling with. We have people on the city council who I think went along with it because we had a mayor who was running that as something that he supported. Otherwise, it probably would not have gotten supported. So you can support it because that's what you are supposed to do, but do you really support it? That's another thing. That's another thing. You don't really see I don't really see the support in this happening, but that doesn't mean we're not going to keep going. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to try and create the best district that we possibly can with the limitations we have to work with. Because my mother told me a long time ago, you can do whatever you want to do. And because my mother said it, I believe I can do whatever I want to do. Now, I know there are limits, but I think even with this project, as we're doing more, as we're getting it to be a more viable type of project and getting people to really understand what it's about and what it could do for the city, I think we'll have more support, not only just from the folks who are out there and they know this is a good thing, but for the folks who are making decisions about what needs to happen with the city and what areas they need to support and where the money needs to go and that kind of thing.
From a support within the city of Fayetteville, from residents and city council, and what do you feel like the next step is? What would you like to see happen to show some forward movement? Or what is the next step that we can rally around to try to continue to see this work take place?
Of course, a lot of things end up being financial. And I know that's not the only issue, but that is a driving force behind whether something makes it or not. And so I think there may be ways that we can get city officials to see the benefit of this, and they can put more things into their budget to support this happening, whether it be in infrastructural development or things that they can do to allow something like this to be created without a lot of bureaucracy behind it. And also in their other, I'm thinking Parks and Rec and that kind of thing, other avenues that we can secure support or funds or resources as a city. Start including this as a part of that. I think if it's not supported by the mayor, it will not happen with the council. That I know for a fact. So we've got to have her be more involved. And I'm thinking just making sure that any places where there can be some resources, that she's keeping that in mind, that she's keeping the project in mind. This is going to benefit Fayetteville if we do it the right way. There are lots of economic benefits from this if we do it the right way. But we've got to have the buy-in from the folks who are making the decisions, the council. We've got to have the buy-in and the driving force from the mayor if it's going to happen. That's what I would like to see.
I typically end every conversation with two questions.
Okay.
And the first question is around our fears. I feel like it's important to normalize the things that we are fearful for, because it puts it on the table and allows us to really, hopefully, maybe objectively. I think my question for you within this scope that we've been talking today, what are your fears for this place?
I hate to say it, but one of my big fears is lack of community support. And I say that because historically, if our community thinks that the city is involved, they know that the city is not invested in anything that helps our community. So that makes the community members stand back or be uninvolved or negative about things that are going on. And that's my biggest fear, is that we have to get as many folks involved in this process as we possibly can. And I just hope it doesn't break down before it gets going due to lack of community support. That's my biggest fear. And the other thing is just not being able to stay the course, having the process, but being able to stay the course for the amount of time that it takes to really make this a viable project. We're not looking at overnight, but we're looking at stages of development where we can make this become a real long-term sustainable type of project that everybody can access and be happy about and that kind of thing. So just having what it takes to sustain the process to make it work. So
You've mentioned that you believe this is driven by a higher power. What do you mean by that?
I believe that my marching orders came from God. I believe that this is not my idea because I had no interest, no desire, there was nothing in the fabric of my body that was interested in building anything or even returning to Fayetteville at this level because I knew that my family wouldn't be coming with me. So I had to hear the message, be obedient to the message, and realize that he was going to make sure, he meaning my higher power, was going to make sure he gave me what I needed to make this something successful. So I'm just following the orders of the man above, and because I believe that's where this comes from.
Amen to that. One of the questions that I try to end on is, and really the theme of so many of these conversations, is this concept of wholeness. As we look at a community, what does it look like to try to create a community that is whole? And so this is the work you are doing. And so within the scope of this conversation of the work that you're doing, what does wholeness look like? What could it look like?
I can say this. I'm not very encouraged about achieving wholeness based on the sign of the times right now. But because I think in order to achieve wholeness, you've got to be able to accept differences in others. You've got to be in touch with your implicit biases that you have and be okay talking about them and addressing them in a meaningful manner, or else things don't happen to get everyone on the same page, going in the same direction. This whole thing about DEI, that's an issue right now. And I'm very thankful that Mayor Molly took a stand to a certain extent, but that's something more than many other people will not take. That's a stand that many people will not take. But it at least shows an effort on her part to recognize that people are diverse. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, if you can include people who have different mindsets and ideologies and backgrounds and all that, it'll make the process better. There's so much data that they have on why it works better when you have a diverse group of people working. That's how you achieve wholeness, recognizing the diversity, allowing people a voice, allowing people to be able to express different opinions and ideologies about things and coming to some conclusion about that. But people are afraid of doing that now. So how do you get to that point? I don't know. It's one of those things that I should have answered that as a part of the last question, because that's a fear, is that unless there are some changes in the way the country is going right now, it's going to be hard to even create a Black Historic District. That's going to be one of the things that will be a hindering factor, because somebody will challenge it as being just for the Black people, and that's not what it's about.
Well, Ms. Davis, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think what the work that you're doing and the voice that you have is necessary and needed. And so I just want to say thank you for the work that you have been doing, that you are doing, and that you will be doing, because our community needs it, maybe in ways that we don't even fully understand.
Right. That is so true.
So thank you for sharing a table with me. Thank you for your time and the work that you're doing. Our community is better because you are here and you are working and calling us to a higher standard. And so it's been a privilege to be able to sit with you today and hear your story, and just please continue to tell us how we as a community can support the work that needs to be done so much. Thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate you inviting me. I don't like to do interviews, but sometimes I talk and I don't know when to not talk. I appreciate you inviting me to share this.
It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Well, a deep thank you to Mrs. Davis, who is helping us to remember what so many communities across Northwest Arkansas are fighting to preserve: their place, their presence, their history. She reminded us that the stories of Southeast Fayetteville aren't just important, they're foundational to understanding who we are as a region. We have heard about the legacy of families who have stayed through hardship and attempts at expulsion. They built despite exclusion, and they held on even as institutional systems worked to erase them. And we were reminded that honoring those legacies requires more than money. It requires policy, it requires recognition, and it requires courage from the broader community to speak up before it's too late. But the work of preservation doesn't just happen through oral history or cultural storytelling. It happens in zoning hearings and planning documents. It happens in the language of land use maps and building codes and permit approvals, the bureaucratic tools that have, for decades, quietly but systematically displaced Black residents from Southeast Fayetteville. In our next episode, we're going to continue this conversation with Allie Thurman Quinlan. She's an architect, the owner of Flintlock Lab, and a former Fayetteville planning commissioner. And she helps us to understand how these systems have been used to target Black neighborhoods under the disguise of neutrality. Together, we'll ask what it means to take these same tools and use them not for exclusion, but for repair and protection and justice. I want to say thank you again for listening, and I want to say thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.